So hopefully we're going to finish the Mishnah now. And we're up to Vimnisei Shelo Bershus. Let's just explain that we've been discussing a case until now where only one witness testified that her husband had died. And she relied on that one witness and she got married. And then it turns out her husband was alive. Now we want to know what happens if Bezdin relied on mistaken testimony. I'm using the word mistaken, lekaf skuz. And there were two witnesses that testified to the effect that her husband died. Now, this case subdivides into two scenarios. One is called Niseis al pi Bezdin, and one is called Niseis Shelo al pi Bezdin, or Shelo Bershus Bezdin. So let's talk first about Niseis Shelo Bershus. And there's something in this Mishnah that's what I call counterintuitive at first glance, but we'll understand the Mishnah as we go along. If she went to Bezdin and Bezdin did not allow her to get married, they never gave her the green light, the reshus to get married, muteres lachzor. If he comes into Bezdin, the original Baal, and he says, look, I'm alive, then she can resume her marriage with him. Which again, as I said, is counterintuitive because we're talking about a case where she got married without the reshus of Bezdin. Now again, she heard the testimony of two witnesses. But for one reason or another, Bezdin did not grant her permission to get remarried. Was she violating the will of the courts? If yes, then she went and got married, Shelo Bershus. We wonder why she shouldn't be punished, like the case where there was one witness. And then the Mishnah establishes that Niseis al pi Bezdin, just the opposite conclusion. That if the court sanctioned her ability to get married, takes it. She can't go back to her first husband if he's still alive. So the Gemara is going to explain, we'll just give it a preview of coming attractions, that this second case of Niseis al pi Bezdin was a case where there was only one witness. Now, Bezdin gave her a conditional reshus to get remarried. They said to her, look, we only have the testimony of one witness. Go out there and do your research. And if you can clarify beyond the shadow of a doubt that your husband is indeed dead, then we'll rely on your work and your investigation. But you're playing with fire over here, because if in effect your husband is alive and you get remarried based on the testimony of one witness and you had no other evidence, you're going to suffer all the consequences and the penalties that we described in the Mishnah. But the previous case of Nisei Shelo Bershus, that's a case where although she didn't get the official sanction from the courts, but nevertheless, there were two witnesses. So she did have what to rely on because there were two witnesses. Now, she got married on her own initiative without a reshus of Bezdin. And apparently, in a case where there were two witnesses, she doesn't need reshus Bezdin. She'll need reshus Bezdin in the case of one witness, and then she'll get a conditional reshus Bezdin And that condition is that she do her due diligence, which is called Daiku Mitzvah. She has to look around and hear from the people evidence that her husband died. And as I said before, she takes a great risk if she gets married. But nevertheless, Beis Din gives her a shush to do so. They're not going to say, wait for the rest of your life as an unmarried single woman because maybe your husband is alive. But rather, Beis Din is going to say, we'll rely on A plus B. A is the testimony of one witness, and B is your research, we'll call it, your investigation. And together the two will be considered like they were two witnesses. But if she doesn't do her due diligence, and sure enough, the husband's alive and well, she's in deep trouble. She's going to be washing dishes for a long time. She's in hot water. But in the first case of this Shalom Reshus, she doesn't need the sanction of Beis Din because there were two witnesses that testified. She's eligible to get remarried based on the testimony of two witnesses. Now, this opens up an entire Pandora's box, which is one of the most fundamental questions of this parak in Yevamos. What allows a married woman, what is the agent or the power or the matir that allows a married woman to get remarried when her husband dies? Is it the evidence or is it the Reshus Beis Din? Our Mishnah seems to be taking the position that her heter to get remarried is built into the evidence. The testimony of two Eidin, once they were accepted, is enough to generate a matir, and she can get remarried. Does she need the formal Reshus of Beis Din? The answer is no, because the Reshus and the matir is inherent in the testimony of two witnesses. The Torah relied on two witnesses. That clarifies beyond the shadow of a doubt that her husband is dead. We don't assume that the witnesses are lying. And therefore, she can go ahead and get married without having to suffer any consequences if, heaven forbid, these Eidim perjure themselves and her husband's alive. But in a case where Beis Din allowed her to get married on the basis of one witness, which is a takanas chachamim, that we can be matir a davar shebe'erva without shnei eidim, even though the Torah says al pi shnayim eidim yakum davar, what the Rabbanan are doing is they're creating an evidence which is so compelling and so reliable that it's equivalent to two eidim, but it's not two eidim. And here she needs the Reshus of Beis Din, but it's going to be a conditional Reshus of Beis Din. And Beis Din say, right now we have only one of two variables in the equation. You have to bring us and prove to us the second variable, namely that you did your research, your investigation, and you had every reason to believe, you were absolutely convinced that your husband is gone. Now the Mishnah enters into the issue of chatas. Eishes isha zinsa. Obviously, we're not talking about an adulteress who did it deliberately. She is a shogeges. She has to bring a karma chatas. But it's a strange kind of situation because although she deserves patch, she deserves to be penalized, as we saw in that Mishnah, because Beis Din only gave her the authority and the license to get remarried based on the fact that she would do the research, and she didn't. But nevertheless, can a penalty generate a chiyuv karma? What do I mean? once the takana was that we can accept the testimony of one aid together with Hadaiko Mitzvah, and the Rabbanan said that this is like there are two Eidim, to such an extent that they allowed her, they gave a formal sanction to get remarried, then she should not be bringing a carbon. And that's what the Mishnah codifies here, uptura min carbon. And basically, we're going to, in a sense, blame Bezdin for relying on one aid and allowing her to get remarried. So that even though Bezdin didn't do anything wrong, and on the contrary, if anyone deserves the penalty, it's her, but nevertheless, in terms of what we call gram misa, meaning who or what caused a criminal crime which is capital in part of the nature, namely to have a relationship with another man and she's still married to her first husband, the gorem, the cause in its root, goes back to Bezdin. I just want to read you one line here in the English. He says, a woman who remarries on the basis of a single witness does so in accordance with the dictate of Bezdin. There's no chiyuv korban chatos in a case where she had a heter from the Bezdin. We've been saying that the heter of the Bezdin was conditional, and that condition never came to fruition. She didn't do her due diligence. But the Mishnah is not taking that approach. The Mishnah is taking the approach that she did get a formal heter, and that is enough to undermine a chiyuv chatos. Now let's go back to the previous case. There were two witnesses, but there was no reshus bezdin. Is she chayva chatos? And again, we're talking about her relationship with the second husband. Lo nisei salpi bezdin. That's called nisei shalom reshus in the previous paragraph of the Mishnah. Teisei v'chayeves b'kor. Now, how could you say Teitze? We just finished saying that Nisei Shalom Rishus Muteris Lachzor. So what's Teitze? Teitze is nothing. And what do I mean it's nothing? It means she goes back to her first husband. And that's what Teitze means. She's not married to a second husband because she was married to her first husband and remains married to her first husband. And now, Chayeves b'karma. Why? Because there was no reshus bezdin. As we said before, when we can attribute in its root the cause of her chiyuv misa or chiyuv kares to bezdin, and bezdin gave her the okay, then we undermine the chiyuv karma. But if there was no heter bezdin, she relied on the two witnesses. After they gave their testimony, they testified in court on a Tuesday that her husband is dead. She's been living for years now, waiting to get out of this marriage because her husband is dead. Now there are two witnesses. They were accepted finally. And we have full-fledged evidence that the Torah relies upon. She went ahead and got married. She's not waiting for a heter bezdin. She doesn't have to wait for a heter bezdin. But she has to know that in event that a husband is still alive, again, it's not a question of penalty. We're not penalizing her because she relied on two witnesses. Little did she dream that these two witnesses were perjuring themselves. But nevertheless, she's going to have to bring a carbon. Now, I'm not sure if one carbon suffices. And for that, we have to learn sugyas in Masechet Shabbos. Very complicated sugyas. because she's been living with the second guy over and over again. She had an intimate relationship with him. Does each one of those relations require a separate carbon? I mean, that'll run her out of all monies that she ever could have dreamt, even if she's a billionaire. I mean, depending on how long she's married to the second. So again, it's a strange kind of halacha that a woman is exempt from a karban chatas, but only because of the formal sanction of Beis Din. When there was a formal sanction of Beis Din, even though she deserves all sorts of penalties, but there's no chiyuv chatas. And the Rabbanan cannot institute a chiyuv chatas. That would be chulul as. But in a case where there was no sanction of Beis Din, and she went and got married based on the testimony of Tuay, and paradoxically, in that case, when she gets remarried, she needs a karban chatas because she can't rely on the p'tur, so to speak, the exemption of a heter Beis Din. She didn't have a heter Beis Din. And the Mishnah codifies this with a certain phrase, a principle that goes the following: Yafa koach Beis Din shepotra min hakarban. That paradoxically, in the case where there was only one witness to the effect that her husband died, she is parted from a karban because of koach Beis Din yafa koach Beis Din. Because Beis Din relied on that one witness together with Daikon Mitzvah. They gave her the license, the green light to get remarried. Hence, she's parted from a karban. That's the yafa koach Beis Din. Shepotra min hakarban. Dafka leniency in the case of one. Finally, the Mishnah concludes by saying the following: Horua Beis Din li nase beholcha v'kilkala chayeves v'karban shelo hitirua elo li nase. This is mind-boggling. We're both saying this part of the Mishnah will only make sense in Mirza Hashem when we see the Sunnah. Because what happened was, she went ahead and had a relationship with another man, but she was not married to the other man. Beis Din gave her a limited sanction. They allowed her to get remarried, but not to have some sort of a free love lifestyle, if you pardon the expression. And in such a case, she's now going to have to bring a karban because her husband is alive and she had a bia of Eishes Ish, which is the chiyuv kares, the chiyuv misa, and it generates the chiyuv karban b'shogeg. Wait a second. You just finished telling me that Beis Din allowed her to get remarried. Beis Din relied on one witness that her husband had died, and she doesn't bring a karban. Why? Because of the koach Beis Din yafa. What happened to the koach Beis Din yafa here in the case of Kilkala, where instead of getting married to a second husband, she had some sort of flirty relationship? But the answer is that the heter Beis Din was only for Nisuin. The formula, the official document that was given to her with the signature of the Beis Din was, you can now get remarried. But to go ahead and have free love, that we're not going to allow, and there's no heter Beis Din for that. And if there's no heter Beis Din, she's guilty of a capital crime, not b'mezid, but at least unintentionally, and she's chayav a karban. She has to bring a karban. Shlo hitirua el linas. The heter Beis Din only applies to her marrying someone else, but not to living that free life. He writes here in the art scroll, he writes, Beis Din's authorization permitted her to enter into a lawful marriage only. Her improper cohabitation, which the Gemara is going to define, is inconsistent with this authorization. She did not act with judicial sanction, but on her own volition, and therefore the dispensation of Tur Karbon no longer applies. And now we get to the Sugya Sagamor. Now let's go back to the beginning of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ubo v'omru meis bailet. And it sounds like there are two witnesses because Bo v'omru is in the plural. Midik tani seifa niseis shelo b'rshus muteres laxar bo laxar lo. And if she gets married without the sanction of President, then if her husband is still alive, let me just go through it one more time in my mind. Right. So again, she doesn't need the Rishus of Bezdin. Again, she'll have to bring a carbon, but she doesn't need the Rishus of Bezdin to get married to the second guy. Because there were two witnesses. Shelo Rishus Bezdin ela b'yeved. There were two witnesses. So that's what it says in the second half of the Mishnah. Michlal, that implies that the first half of the Mishnah is B'rshus Bezdin. What does it mean that she got a Rishus of Bezdin? After all, two Eidim is enough. She doesn't need a Rishus Bezdin. The answer is B'yed Echad. She got married with the sanction of Bezdin, because Bezdin accepted the testimony of one witness. Alma Eid Echad Nema. Now again, I don't understand what the Gemara means by Eid Echad Nema. The Torah says, Al Pi Shnayim Eidim Yakum. So the Gemara must be operating with some sort of a premise that under certain occasions, even in a Dover Sheba Ereva, Bezdin can rely on the testimony of one witness and give her a sanction to get remarried. And that's what goes on in the Reisha. Utnan Nami, and the Gemara wants to support this conclusion from a Mishnah later on in the Masechet. Huksaku lios masian eid mipi eid. Huksaku means it was accepted practice that they would marry off a woman based on eid mipi eid. In other words, if one witness says, I heard from so-and-so that her husband died, that's good enough. Even isha mipi isha. Or alternatively, isha mipi evet, mipi shifra. Alma eid echad mehema. Right, the language of the Mishnah is that so-and-so testified on the basis of what he heard from so-and-so. The one who's quoting the other one he has no knowledge on his own. He can't testify. He can only bring to the attention of the court the testimony of the first witness. And yet the Mishnah says that in these cases, Masiyan al pi eid echad, or otherwise known as eid mipi eid. Alma, we see clearly that eid echad mehema. Once again, my old question comes to haunt me. What do you mean Eid Echad Nem? Is that a Doraisa Allah? The Torah says Al Pishnayim Eidim Yaakov. The Gemara, I think, is already anticipating the punchline of this entire sugya that the Rabbanah relied on that which would not be sufficient evidence in a Torah a Torah governed law legal system. Nami, I want to bring you another Mishnah from Masechet Krisus to prove that a testimony of one single witness is accepted. Nami, I saw that you ate chelev. Again, b'shogeg, but who omer lo achalta? He says, I never ate chelev, but he is makrish the eight. Time of the omer lo achalta, or ishtik meheman. Had he said nothing, and he didn't argue against the witness and try to contradict the witness, then we rely on the testimony of the witness. And he's obligated to bring a korban chatas alma eid echad miheman. You see, I don't understand. This eid echad miheman is not a davar shebe'erev. For example, if it was relevant to give him malchus in the case of Mason, we would not rely on the testimony of one aid. Gemara is assuming, again, the two ways of learning this. Either Gemara is assuming that chatos is a davar shebe'erev. I'm not sure exactly why that's so. Or the Gemara is assuming, but this has to be a doraisa. See, here we can't introduce a takanas chachamim because chacham cannot be mechayvi with korban. It would be chulin lazor. And I don't understand how could the Gemara prove from Eid Echad b'chelev that he's chayv v'chatas. Therefore, Eid Echad could be relied upon in a davar shebe'erev. What is going on? And what? I don't think he would have to take a shmua if he's convinced that he didn't need he didn't need chelev, then he's part of a korban. Like the Torah says, "V'hu yod anshe yoda mipiatzmo." He has to know that or he could rely on the Eid Echad who said that when you ate was chelev. Maybe he doesn't know, but there's no room for shmua. What I think is going on in this sugya, but it's wild, and it makes no sense what I'm going to say, but I'm going to see if I can, as we get more and more into Masechet Yevamot, in this parak, I think I can maybe support it. Not sure, I'm hoping. Is that in the case of Eishes Ish, the Rabbanon took it out of the state of Erev, of Arayas, and they only dealt with the Isur element. to apply the principle of Eid Echad Nem Bisurim. So again, on a Torah level, obviously you want to establish that a married woman is allowed to get remarried, and the first issues is gone. You need two Eidim for that. Al Pishnayim Eidim Yaakov Dova. But the Rabbanan, in their capacity and authority under the law of evidence, they can create an evidence that is comparable to Shnei Eidim. And if they rely on that evidence, then the Rabbanan could establish that that evidence is as if we heard the testimony of two Eidim. And the Gemara thinks that all we have to do is quote the halacha, prove the halacha of Eid Echad Nem Bisurim in the case of Chelev, to identify this food that he ate as Chelev. We believe one ate, that's called Eid Echad Nem Bisurim. Avela, he brings a carbon chatas. But in the case of allowing a woman to get remarried, and we have to see an Al Pi Eid Echad, or Eid Mi Pi Eid, we're going to have to say that's Takanas Chachamim, to allow a married woman to get remarried. The only problem I have is once you've already proven from the mission of Eid Mi Pi Eid that we rely on Eid Echad in certain cases because we upgraded to the level of two Eidim. So why does the Gemara feel compelled to quote another mission with regard to Chelev? That seems like anticlimactic. You've already proven it from Eishes Ish. So the Gemara says, "Midoraisa minola." Okay, the Mishnah is predicated on the assumption that Eid Echad is believed, but where the Mishnah know is Sanya, and now we're quoting the parsha at the beginning of Vayikra of Karban Chelev. It says, "Ohoda Elav Chatasa." His sin became known to him. It's not enough that others testify against him. But what happens in the case where he's not contradicting the Eidim? Should we say that we don't rely on the testimony of two Eidim to Mechayv Mechatos? All right, I think with your reshus, we're going to stop here because the Gemara is going to go back and forth, trying to prove that a single aid is trusted on a doraisa level. And we're going to see that Eid Echad Neman, that might not prove anything about a case of Eishes Ish where the Torah requires two Eid. That's going to be this exciting sugya that I told you about, that we try to figure out what constitutes evidence according to the Jewish law. So let's make a note of where we got up to. Do I have a pencil here? I'm almost sure I took one out, but so we know that tomorrow we'll start with Midoraisa Minon. Okay then? Opportunity to wish you a great day.